point that Dave just made about the Mumia exception. In law, over the U.S. Supreme Court in Washington, D.C., go down there, you know, I'm not going to pay your way down there on the train, but go down there and look. It says equal justice under the law. And that means in any fair-minded interpretation that the law is applied to this person the same as that person. But when you look at Mumia's case, there's instance after instance after instance where the Pennsylvania Supreme Court has taken its precedent and turned it around when applicable to the Mumia case. Now, Dave had mentioned something related to Prosecutor McGill's penalty phase argument about appeal after appeal after appeal. There was something even more equally outrageous, that Mumia's opinion came down the first time from the Pennsylvania Supreme Court in March of 1989. In February of 1989, the Supreme Court issued a ruling essentially saying that if this particular legal point is violated, it's an automatic new trial. This legal point was of such ancient origin that it requires a new trial. 28 days later, they said it's no longer applicable to people who are convicted of killing police officers. That's where the abu-jamal exception phrase came from. One of the issues in the case in terms of Sabo, both at trial and particularly during 1995, was his statements to the jury, his statements in the court, his badgering of the witnesses, his badgering particularly of the defense attorney, his ridiculing of the defense attorney at the trial, and the split between the attorney and abu-jamal. In March of 1988, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court granted a new trial to a person who was a former Pennsylvania state trooper who shot and killed a woman in a judge's office. And the Pennsylvania Supreme Court gave him a new trial because the judge raised one single question during a trial that spanned almost 2 weeks. So again, we see time after time after time. David brought up the piece about lynching. And you would think that that just never happened. And if it did happen, it happened someplace else. Well, there was a lynching in Pennsylvania. There was a couple. The last one was 1912 in Coatesville. But this lynch mob atmosphere is important. In preparation for coming here today and in some other events that may or may not take place this week, I was looking back at 1995 and looking over how media looked at what Sabo was doing. And there was a couple of things that popped out. One was that Sabo's actions were so biased that even Philadelphia's normally anti-Abu-Jamal media criticized it. The Daily News and the Inquirer both wrote editorials criticizing Sabo's bias. Now, if that wasn't bad enough, within a month span before the hearing and a month span after the hearing, there were over 700 articles published in papers in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the United States, Europe, South America, and Southeast Asia. You hear what I'm saying? Hundreds of articles. Many of those articles pointed out the bias of Sabo. Now, the defense team, when they appealed Mumia's that 95 hearing to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, they said, listen, you don't believe us. You don't believe us when we say that there is bias. So here, look at these articles. And when the Pennsylvania Supreme Court issued its ruling in 1998, it said the opinions of a handful of journalists do not convince us that Judge Sabo was incapable of being impartial. Well, I don't know what they define handful as, but handful certainly is not 200, 300, 400, or 500. But there was something else that happened in that 1995 trial that goes directly to lynch mob atmosphere. The hearing began under the specter of a death warrant that had been issued against abu-Jamal. Now, what better classic definition of a lynch mob atmosphere than holding a hearing to try to save a man's life when there's an open death warrant on him during that time? So at the very least, that split the attention of his attorneys and that corrupted that whole process. But where did that death warrant come from? Did it just fall down from the sky? No. it came from Governor Tom Ridge. But how did it come from Governor Tom Ridge? Because the Pennsylvania prison officials were illegally opening Mumia's legal mail. And they were looking at it, photocopying it, and forwarding it to the governor's lawyer, who in turn told the governor what was going on. So, both as a courtesy from attorneys telling them, hey, we're going to file an appeal on this date, and they're knowing when the thing was going to be filed because they were illegally reading the mail, they knew when the appeal was going to be filed, and they filed the death warrant a few days beforehand. Now, within the context of what's happening now, and this new book comes out, and these allegations that there is a widow who has been victimized by the Mumia movement, and she's not involved in anything. The illegal mail opening came from what? It came from a complaint from the FOP and Maureen Faulkner that Mumia was illegally practicing journalism in jail, which is a violation. So here we have yet another instance of the FOP and Mrs. Faulkner being integrally involved in the subversion of any semblance of fair justice. And the problem is, and this is where I'm going to get to what you asked me to get to, about the media. The problem is this context never comes out in any of the stories. Code of Ethics, Society of Professional Journalists, Society. Of course it says journalists should test the accuracy of information from all sources and exercise care to avoid inadvertent error. But it goes on to say that journalists should tell the story of diversity and the magnitude of human experience boldly, even when it is unpopular to do so. It is unpopular to say that there may be some problems with this Mumia case. Undoubtedly in Philadelphia, if you say that, you would be better off smacking Mother Teresa, digging her up and smacking her. Because people just will not want to hear it. But as a responsibility, as an ethical responsibility of journalists, under that sacred mission of Freedom of the Press Clause of the First Amendment, we have a duty to do it, and that's not being done. One of the things that I've noticed in covering this case for almost 26 years is that the coverage of Mumia is a mile wide, but an inch thick. There's a lot of coverage of it, but it's not substantive, it is not in depth. It says support the open exchange of views, even views they find repugnant. Okay, you think Abu-Jamal is guilty. Well, there are people who make an argument that he's not. I've read all of the transcripts, Michael McConnell will say. Well, right now there's a book getting ready to be published in Chicago called The Framing of Mumia Abu-Jamal, where a editor of a legal magazine in Chicago, who used to be an editor of TV Guide when it was located in suburban Philadelphia, read through the transcripts and came to a different conclusion. One of the preeminent articles written on this case, other than one by Dave, he's written a whole lot, and the seminal book on this, was an article written in 1995 or 96 by a guy named Stuart Taylor. And it's called Framed But Guilty. Taylor went through the whole thing, and he said that the trial stunk, to quote Ed Asner, but he read the transcripts. So even if you bring up that other side, you're going to get yelled at. But as a journalist, you have a responsibility to do thorough, balanced, and fair reporting. And listen to this, and this will have a resonance to some people in this room. Society of Professional Journalists Ethics Code, first promulgated in 1927, revised over the years. What does it say? Give voice to the voiceless. Official and unofficial sources of information can be equally valid. Give voice to the voiceless. What is Mumia known as? What is his moniker? The voice of the voiceless. He is criticized for doing journalism from death row, but the type of journalism that he does, and parenthetically, not about his own case, not about his own case, but other issues. He is giving voice to the voiceless, which is consistent and compliant with the Society of Professional Journalists Ethics Code. But do we hear any of that in any of the debate? Do we hear any of that in any of the discussion? No, we don't.